Morning. It's so good to be with you all on this Lord's Day morning. We are going through lessons this year about building on the rock. And of course, as the passage our elders have chosen to focus our attention on says, in Ephesians 2, around verses 19 to 22, we read that the foundation is the apostles and prophets, and the cornerstone is Jesus Christ. And we're paying particular attention this year to understanding who Jesus was and continues to be. What the Gospels, which are at the center of this whole story of history, tell us about Jesus, as Genesis forward points towards Him coming, as Revelation backwards points back to what He did when He came and lived and taught and died and rose from the dead, declaring Himself to be the Son of God. I want to look this morning at what it means to see Jesus. John tells us in John chapter 12, verse 21, about some Greeks who came to Philip soon after Jesus arrived at Jerusalem, and they said, "Sir, we want to see Jesus." I know how they feel. I want to see Jesus. 1 Peter 1 and verse 8 says, "Though you have not seen Him, you love Him." This is Peter, who walked around with Him and talked with Him and was one of His closest friends, saying to all those he's writing to, including, in a way, us, "You haven't sat there and seen the eyes of compassion or the fierceness of passion for righteousness that this man had in every one of his days. You haven't seen him hanging there, and you haven't seen him risen and glorified, but I know you love him just like I do." Well, how do we do that? How do we love Him when we've never seen Him with our eyes? Well, we go back to the pages of Scripture. And through the eyes of faith, we are able to see what the Holy Spirit wanted to reveal about Jesus. And there's this section of the Gospel of Mark from chapter 8 to chapter 10. It's like Act 2 of the book of Mark, where in this middle section, between the ministry in Galilee in chapter 1 through 7 and the last days in chapter 11 through 16 in Jerusalem, Jesus takes a journey. And it's really like a travel log of all the things that happen along the way as Jesus goes from way up north, really even beyond Galilee, up in Tyre and Sidon, and starts to work his way down with his eyes set towards Jerusalem. And he's preparing for what has to happen. He's also trying to prepare his disciples for what is going to happen. And he wants them to see who he is so they can see what this whole thing is all about. And so it's not just a physical journey. It is a sort of spiritual journey for his disciples. And this section, it's quite interesting, begins with a story about a healing of a blind man. And it ends with a story about a healing of a blind man. And right before this first blind man is healed, we read about the disciples being blind. But here in Mark chapter 8, in verses 17 to 21, we start to see that when Jesus talks about the disciples seeing clearly, He's talking about understanding. Understanding is the key principle here. Remember Isaiah 6, in verses 9 and 10, where Isaiah looks forward to Jesus. Certainly his own ministry sees this happen also, but he looks forward and he talks about those who would have eyes to see and yet not see, and ears to hear and yet not hear. And they wouldn't perceive and they wouldn't understand, but they'd be darkened or hardened in their hearts so that they wouldn't see and understand and turn and be healed. Well, we see here in verse 17, Jesus says, "Do you not perceive or understand?" to His disciples. They didn't get, when He talked about the leaven of the Pharisees, they didn't get that He was talking about something much bigger than just, do we have bread? Really, they don't get who He is. He says in verse 18, having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? In verse 21, he says, do you not understand? This is going to keep coming up over and over again throughout this section. And he's going to keep telling them over and over about who he is. And yet, they'll continue to have difficulty. So what did Jesus want his disciples to see? What did he want them to grasp? We get a pretty good idea here in chapters 8 through 10 of Mark, a particular kind of truth that Jesus wanted his disciples to see about himself and thus about themselves. But we won't understand unless we continue on. Talk about what that means. And unless we confess and unless we crucify. So let's start out with this story in Mark chapter 8 about this blind man from Bethsaida. And beginning in verse 22, we read about this. And, being blind in Jesus' day meant being in abject poverty, being completely at the mercy of those around you. I mean, you couldn't work. It's not like there was a Braille text that you could read and study and go to school. It's not like you could go into the fields. You were completely at the mercy and generosity of those around you, and there was really no hope of being healed. There were no treatments you could go through. And it's not surprising that the blind seeing was a sign that was prophesied that the Messiah had come when you start to see this happening. But here we see a very unique miracle. It's unique in several ways, but one in particular we'll get to. And this is in Bethsaida, and this is the hometown of Philip and Andrew and Peter. This is where they grew up together. And this was not the first time that the villagers in this seaside fishing village had seen Jesus. He'd been through there before, but it was still a big deal when Jesus comes to town. It's news. And so the folks there who knew this blind man, the local blind man in this very small village, said, let's bring him to Jesus. And so they took him, and you can just kind of imagine them leading him by the hand. He's over there. He's up in the marketplace, up in the crowd. And bringing him through the crowd to Jesus. And they beg him, please, just touch him. And Jesus, seeing the blind man, he has compassion on him. But he doesn't want to do this healing there in the midst of all of this. And so he takes him by the hand. And he leads him out of the village. And he does something kind of strange. We only see this in this story and the story of the healing of the deaf man right before the discussion of the disciples being deaf and blind. These are the only two instances we see Jesus spit in the eyes or in the ears of a person. Don't know why he did it, but this is something he does. And then he says, as he lays his hands on this man, do you see anything? And this is where we expect him to praise Jesus and go on his way rejoicing, sight restored. Everything has been accomplished. After all, Jesus laid his hands on him. Jesus doesn't do half miracles. Jesus has all power embodied in himself. He doesn't fail. He doesn't say, well, this will get you part of the way there. Here's some medication and that'll finish up the job. And yet, he says, do you see anything? And the man looks around and he says, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Evidently, this man was not born blind, it would seem to me anyways, and he knew what trees looked like. But the people looked like trees walking. They're just these blurry, tall things moving around, I guess. It's a very vivid way of saying this, isn't it? So he's halfway there to vision? I mean, this is a huge miracle. Don't get me wrong. Going from blindness to blurriness is a big deal. Jesus has already done a miracle. but he can't see clearly like you would expect it to happen. And this is the only time in all 4 Gospels that a partial healing occurs, or that there's this process of healing. And we don't know why, but it certainly illustrates something about these disciples and about us. And this may be why Mark puts an emphasis on this healing right here and chose to include this healing. Because as he went from blind vision to blurry vision to clear vision, the disciples seem to have that same kind of journey. And so do we. Seeing Jesus is a process. It's not something that we just can jump to. That is, to understand all that Jesus is trying to convey about what He is and what we therefore need to be is hard. Not like it's hard to understand. Not like it's hard to get what these words mean or something like that. But it challenges everything we think we know about what life is like. And what this whole game is about and how you win. And what a king looks like. And so we have to learn, just like His disciples, when we think we have a piece of the story, don't stop looking. Don't stop searching the Gospels. Don't stop looking in Isaiah to see what he is saying about Jesus 700 years later. Don't stop meditating every day on who Jesus is. Don't stop talking about it amongst ourselves. What does the cross mean to me? How should I therefore live? Look at where Jesus takes us, or where Mark takes us in the story. Immediately following this healing, a story at the center of this, a series of events really, at the center of all 3 synoptic Gospels, play a part in this journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And so we see this question about who Jesus is. Some of you are like me and have very bad vision, or have at least gone to the optometrist, surely, and to get glasses or contacts. And they always do this whole song and dance where you're looking in one of these machines, and they say, okay, 1 or 2, 2 or 3. I'm like, okay, 2 looks just like 1, but I guess I'll say 2. I don't know. Can I say same? D, none of the above? And sometimes it's hard to tell. And then you get to the end of the story, at the end of the process, and sometimes they'll show, okay, so this is better than this. And you're like, oh yeah, well, that's really blurry, and this is really clear. I guess this had a point, this whole process. Well, here we see 2 lenses in this next section through which we can look at Jesus. And this is the first major crossroads that you come to, every person comes to, in deciding and trying to figure out, what do you see in Jesus? This isn't the whole story. We'll get to that. But you can't go any further until you get the right lens to see Him clearly. And really, everybody's view of Jesus is one of these 2 things. In preparing for this lesson, just for the fun of it, I went to Amazon.com and I looked up books. You choose the drop down. What are you looking for? I'm looking for books. And I put in Jesus. And there were 60,000 books about Jesus. Remember, that's not 60,000 books, 60,000 titles. So imagine how many books there are, boxes of these books in distribution centers and warehouses all over the world that Amazon is holding on to ship out. There's so many different ideas about Jesus. And the first thing that you can tell when you look at some of these different descriptions is which of these 2 lenses are they looking at Jesus through. So here's the 2 lenses. Here's lens 1 and lens 2. Let's read this section. In verse 27, It says, "And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?' And they told him, 'John the Baptist. And others say, Elijah. And others, one of the prophets.'" This is the first lens. Elijah, John the Baptist, one of the prophets, which Elijah and John the Baptist were. Jesus, some people say, is one of the greatest teachers that ever lived. He is one of, the Muslims would say, one of the great prophets. Not the greatest, but one of. Some people say he brought some of the great ideas, the emphasizing love, and that's really important. Deepak Chopra, who had one of the books that I looked at in this long list, has a book called The Third Jesus. And he doesn't believe Jesus was the Messiah or anything like that. But he says we should look at not the first Jesus, which is the Jesus of history, or the second Jesus, which is the Jesus of faith, but the third Jesus. And look at what did he have to say in these spiritual teachings. Well, Chopra is saying basically he's one of the spiritual teachers we should listen to. But Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" in the next verse. And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." The Christ. The Messiah. The Anointed One. That's what that means. The Anointed One. Elsewhere he's called the Holy One. The Righteous One. See, Jesus is either one of or he is the one. And you have to decide that before you can go any further in figuring out who Jesus is. And with his resurrection from the dead, God, it says in Romans 1:1-5, declared him to be the one, the Son of God. There are no others like Jesus. God who came down into the flesh, who lived among us. Though many did not receive him, he died for us and rose from the dead. He did what no other one could do. And there's two things about this. Is he the one historically? And that's something we sort of believe. You just decide. You are the one. And then is he the one for you? And I don't mean, is that subjective truth, he's not the one for me, but he can be the one for you. I mean, are you in your life living like he is the one? Is he the one in your heart? 1 Peter 3:15, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. Is he the one on the throne? Is he the one directing you? Is he the one to whom all your obedience, all your loyalty, all your trust belongs? See, Peter got this far. And that's a big deal. This is an important lens to start to see Jesus in. But Peter had his own assumptions about what it meant to be the Christ. You are the Christ. You're right, Peter. But what does that mean? Well, we're going to find out in the next few verses that Peter didn't get it. He totally missed what it means to be the Christ. See, he's still blurry. He's not blind, but he's not clear. Philip Yancey, who's a writer who wrote a book called The Jesus I Never Knew, the story that leads up to that, I read recently, that book, he was leading through a class of the Gospels, and in preparing for it, he watched hundreds of films from all eras that have had film about Jesus' life. And then he selected from these very different visions of who Jesus was, clips for each time. They would go through a section. Okay, we're going to study the blind man at Bethsaida. You'd watch 5 different versions of different filmmakers starting to interpret what that meant. And of course, oftentimes it showed more about the filmmaker than it showed about Jesus, because you're seeing their interpretation, what they think it means to be Jesus. And I guess that's the only way you could make a film, right? Is you're just revealing what you see. And I don't say that to say, oh, we can't understand. Everything is so relative. We can't understand who Jesus is. I say that to say we have to keep going back to the one reliable source and perfecting our vision. And it's a process that we're clarifying. And we're slowly, taking the spots off our glasses, the assumptions that we bring to the table about what everything is about. And so one of the key things we start to see here is that Jesus has to help us see reality right side up. And that requires him to flip our vision upside down. Look at what happens here. As soon as that confession is made in the story, strictly he charged them to tell no one about him. And in verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things. What? Already you're starting to lose Peter, I think. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. Trying to give it to you as clearly as I can here, folks. He said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." In this 3 chapters, chapters 8 to 10, in this section, this journey, 3 times, Jesus explains to his disciples that he must suffer and die. And it keeps repeating, but they did not understand it, over and over again. For instance, in chapter 9, verse 30 and 31, he explains that the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he's killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. So he keeps coming back to this principle. In chapter 10, verse 32, down to verse 34, again he talks about it. See, we're going to Jerusalem, verse 33 says, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. Do you see the scandal of the cross? The word stumbling block that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 1 of the cross, the Greek word is related to our word scandal. Whoa! How can you accept a gospel of a king? I mean, we're so used to it. We're so used to seeing crosses everywhere. But how do you accept a gospel of a king who is what we would consider the equivalent would be put in an electric chair? We don't wear those on gold chains, do we? Or put those at the top of cathedrals. That's gross. That's the kind of truth, even if it's necessary, if you think that we should have capital punishment, we don't want to think about that kind of thing, even if it was justly done. But that is the kind of scandal that the cross carries with it. This is the grossest, most humiliating, most horrid way that the Romans could think of to kill someone. That's the point of the cross. Is to be so awful, you don't want to look at it, but you never forget it when you see it. And you are not, if you're a slave, you're never going to try to run away again, because look what we do to slaves. We hang them on a cross. And that is where God allowed our King to go. You could start to understand why Peter would have so much difficulty with the great anointed Messiah who's going to be the great conqueror and deliver us all, going through that. And notice what 3 times Jesus brings up about us. He says it right here after he foretells his death. We find the story in chapter 10, verse 35, down to the end of the chapter, of James and John trying to figure out who could be at his right hand and left hand in the kingdom, right? And Jesus says, the greatest of you will be the one who makes himself least. The first will be last. Another time in these chapters, the disciples are talking about who will be the greatest. And Jesus says, what were you talking about? But they didn't want to tell him. But he says, the first will be last. 3 times he says that in this section. The first will be last. Well, that's upside down. In our view, it's actually right side up. Did you know, I didn't know this until a few years ago. Did you know that your eyes actually see the world upside down? There's a refraction that happens in your lenses, and then your brain just switches it. God made smart brains for us to flip it around and allow us to see things right side up. But your eyes are taking it in a different way. In the 1890s, a psychologist named George Stratton carried out some experiments where he tried to normalize his mind's ability to see things. And in one experiment, he wore a set of reversing glasses that flipped his vision upside down for 8 days. And for the first 4 days of the experiment, his vision stayed inverted. But by day 5, it had spontaneously turned right side up, even though he's wearing upside down glasses. His perception had adapted to the new information. But guess what happened when he took the glasses off? Everything was upside down again for a while. We tend so easily to see the world upside down. And we have to learn to look at the world through Jesus-colored glasses, to see things right side up. Jesus flips our vision so that we can start to perceive what life is really about. Through the eyes, through the lens of the cross, we understand these words that he speaks to us. In verse 34, he calls himself, the crowd to him with disciples, and he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself. That means say no to yourself. And this had to have them scratching their heads because they still didn't understand what was going on with them. He says, and take up his cross. Well, what is this? What does this method of execution have to do with being a disciple? Surely much later, they remembered these sayings, and the lens started to become clearer. Deny yourself and take up your cross, and only then can you rightly follow me. You call yourself a disciple. You're following me around from city to city, but you're going to learn that to really follow me, you have to follow me all the way up to my crucifixion. And you have to be crucified as well. Crucifixion was not a pleasant thing. That was a painful way to die, a shameful way to die. But we go up to the cross. And we don't take Jesus' cross, we take our cross, and we follow him. And so Romans 6 says when we go into the waters of baptism, we are buried with Christ and we're baptized into his death, that we might rise with him. And so Paul says in Galatians 2:20 and onward that I have been crucified with Christ. And it's no longer I that live. It's not me making these choices anymore. I'm denying myself those choices, and now it's Christ living in me, helping me to see how to be last, helping me to see how to lift others up. Booker T. Washington wrote a famous biography of his life from slavery and into freedom. And he talks at one point about something that happened to him. He talks about how the slaves would be given garments of flax to wear. And he says, I can't imagine a greater torture than to wear a new flax garment. It's like having 100 points of needles poking constantly into you over and over again. And eventually it would wear softer over time. And he said, one of the greatest acts of love I have ever seen happened by a slave in Virginia when my brother took my new flax garment and wore it on his own back until it was soft and ready for me to wear. That's denying yourself. That's taking a kind of cross on your back. That's being least to make someone else first. As Philippians 2 says, don't consider your interests to be the most important things, but put the interests of others above yourself, just as Jesus Christ. Have this mind in you, which was first in Jesus Christ, who, though he had equality with God, didn't count it as something to be grasped, but he emptied himself and made himself a servant even to the point of death on the cross. So that now, someday, every knee will bow and every mouth will confess that Jesus is Lord. The cross helps us to see the glory on the other side of lowering ourselves. We follow Christ through the cross and into the resurrection and someday into glory. So here's challenge number 8. We haven't talked a lot about Bible meditation, but all it really means is to think about the Bible. Take a verse of Scripture and think about it. So the challenge is meditate. Think about Mark 8:34. That is, if anyone would follow me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me if you want to be my disciple. What does Jesus want to say to me if I would be his disciple? We surely, every time we come back to the cross, become more like the Lord, become more focused on things that matter most and able to see eternity. You can't understand this invitation of Jesus to take up a cross until you understand that he has taken your flax garment on himself. That he has borne your sorrows and difficulties and the chastisement that you and I should have borne, so that we can put on a new garment, one that looks like him. He's given us the shirt off his back, so to speak, and so Paul says, put on Christ. We put on Christ in the waters of baptism, having repented and decided to trust him, to confess, as Peter did, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and to walk with him, denying ourselves from that day on. If you're not a disciple, you can be one today. Please come while we stand and sing.